Speaker, I rise today alongside Mr. Rose, Ms. Maloney, Mr. Nadler, Mr. King of New York, and others to urge the immediate passage of the Never Forget the Heroes Act, introduced by Representatives Carolyn Maloney, Nadler, and King, which would fully fund and extend the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund's authorization through 2090. Representatives Maloney, Nadler, and Peter King have been stalwart advocates of this effort, fighting on behalf of 9/11 victims and their families since the beginning. And it's thanks to their leadership that we passed the Zeldin Act, creating the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, and why we are still here fighting today. I can't thank enough and praise enough the leadership of Representatives Maloney, Nadler, and King on this very important issue on behalf of the victims of September 11th. James Zeldin was one of those fearless leaders who rose up on 9/11. He was also the first NYPD officer whose death in 2006 was connected to toxic exposure at the World Trade Center site. The James Zeldin 9/11 Health and Compensation Act was later signed into law in 2011 to help our 9/11 first responders. 5 years later, the Zeldin Act was permanently reauthorized and included $4.6 billion for the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund over 5 years, which was established to provide compensation for the victims of 9/11 and their families, and continues to provide compensation for those suffering from 9/11 related illnesses decades later and their loved ones. First responders who worked on the pile day and night, aiding in the search, rescue, and cleanup efforts, were breathing in toxic debris and ash that are now known to have caused over 50 different types of cancer. However, last month, the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund issued an alarming report, which stated its funding was insufficient to compensate all claims, and the fund would have to make severe cuts to awards across the board. This is unacceptable, and regardless of party affiliation, regardless of which district or state you come from, it is imperative that this legislation is passed and sent to the President immediately to become law so we can ensure these victims receive the compensation they deserve. This isn't a one-off issue. This isn't just a New York issue. This isn't a Democratic or Republican Party platform or political football. This is a responsibility we all shoulder as Americans first and foremost. It's the spirit of our nation, and it's who we are as a people. It's important to remember that 9/11 first responders live not only in New York, but 433 out of 435 congressional districts across this country. These were the very men and women who, in the face of evil, were willing to put it all on the line to help save their fellow Americans who ran into the towers as everyone else ran out. It is unconscionable that time and again they have been forced to plead their case as to why they are worthy of our support. People who came down when the Zeldin Act was first getting authorized, sick, weren't there to fight in 2015 when it was permanently reauthorized because they had passed away due to their injuries. People who were here in 2015 when that fight was made for the Zeldin Act to be permanently reauthorized are not here today to fight for the Victim Compensation Fund because they passed away and succumbed to their injuries. We should not make them take dozens of trips down here to Washington, D.C., begging for support. Let them stay where they are and take care of their health. That's most important. It's so important that we immediately pass the Never Forget the Heroes Act, which will ensure these heroes receive the support they have more than earned. This past September 11th, 17 years since the attacks, we came together as we always do to remember those who were taken from us that day. But this year marked an especially harrowing occasion. By the end of 2018, more people had died from 9/11 related illnesses than were killed on September 11th. Tonight we're going to hear from the authors of the Never Forget the Heroes Act, Representatives Carolyn Maloney, Peter King, and Jerry Nadler, and so many others from both sides of the aisle on why this legislation is important for the victims of 9/11, their communities, and for our nation. In addition to those who are joining us this evening, there are also so many activists and outside organizations fighting on behalf of 9/11 victims and working to ensure they receive full compensation. John Stewart, who has traveled to Washington countless times to fight for them and was just here last week. John Feel from my district and the Feel Good Foundation, and so many more. including the great advocates from organized labor, especially law enforcement and first responders in New York and nationwide. From everyday men and women in my district to us on the floor of the House of Representatives, it is up to each and every one of us to never forget the men and women who we lost that day, those who we have lost since, those suffering from 9/11 related illnesses, and their families. First, I'd like to yield to Congresswoman Maloney, a fellow New Yorker who has been a stalwart champion of this legislation going all the way back to the passage of the Zadroga Act. I know our 9/11 first responders, their families, those suffering from 9/11 related illnesses, and all those affected by this dark moment in our nation's history are so grateful to you, Ms. Maloney, and for your tireless work on behalf of them. With that, I yield to the gentlelady from New York for 5 minutes.